For the first time in F1 history, for this year, there were no changes in the F1 driver market. The good news is that's not going to be the case in 2025. We already know Lewis Hamilton's making his blockbuster move to Ferrari, but Scott, it's not just going to be about Lewis, is it? This driver market is wide open.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got at least one vacancy at Red Bull. You've got the vacancy at Mercedes, but we don't know what's going to happen at Aston Martin either, with Fernando Alonso waiting in the wings to see what opportunities do arise elsewhere. And then the further down the grid you go, the more uncertainty there is, right up to and including Audi's works team. What are they going to do? Is it going to be all changed there as they get ready for 2026? So after some relative stagnation and a really underwhelming driver market, Hamilton blew the doors wide open at the start of the season, and I think it's only going to get more fun from here.
And what's great about this is not only are there lots of vacancies, but there's not really sort of one person who's set for each seat. Like, all the drivers appear to have multiple options as well. Ben, one of the men who has obviously plenty of options because he's kept them wide open is Fernando Alonso, who's been very clear in not committing himself to Aston Martin, certainly before he needs to. What are Alonso's options really here? Are we talking about him aiming for that Mercedes seat? And if so, based on what we've seen so far this year, is Aston Martin to Mercedes actually a step up?
Well, it looked like Mercedes was kind of his best alternative to Aston Martin. And as you say, maybe a bit of a baby step forward, if you could call it that. Certainly at the start of the year, we were hearing that Alonso was kind of Mercedes' plan B. But recently, it seems that Alonso's pushing more and more for the Red Bull seat. You know, there's a chance to go in there alongside Verstappen for somebody, maybe even instead of Verstappen, but I'm sure we'll get to that.
I can't imagine Alonso and Verstappen together. That's, I mean, it would be box office, but...
It would be box office. And if it was up to me, that's what would happen. You know, Ferrari have gone all out with Hamilton and Leclerc, so come on, you know, Red Bull should follow suit and get Alonso and Verstappen in there. It makes sense for Alonso he'd want to push for that, because obviously he's short of time. And he needs to crack on if he wants to add that world title. So I can understand why he's pushing for the Red Bull option. But yeah, him alongside Verstappen, I think it would be great, but it's probably not the most sensible move from Red Bull's point of view.
Taking the Mercedes Red Bull link there, what's going on with Toto Wolff and this seemingly very public courting of Verstappen? I get that Toto can't control the questions that he's being asked, and I respect that he gives an honest answer and he's telling us what he really thinks, but I'm just surprised that it's never just the general platitudes, is it? It's never Max is a great driver, anyone would be lucky to have him. It feels more focused than that.
Yeah, Toto's got a bit of a fixation on Max. I think it still hurts him that he missed out way back in 2014 and Red Bull kind of took him from under Toto's nose, is how he would see it. I guess it also helps as a little bit of a distraction from, you know, repetition of the issues they've got more widely with the car and the correlation with the factory.
Get yourself in the news for a different reason.
Exactly, yeah. Talk about another team's driver. Doesn't hurt to try and destabilise that team a bit as well, as it's an old rival, and it just deflects a bit of attention away from the fundamental problems. I think also Toto, to be fair to him, has said quite consistently that as much as he would love to have Max and it would kind of complete the circle for him, he's not going to get him unless they can sort the car out. So that's the first order problem always. If they can do that, then Mercedes looks like a more attractive option if Verstappen wants to leave Red Bull, and also for Alonso if he wants to leave Aston Martin.
There's a fine line between intent and desperation, and I think Wolff is flirting with it a little bit, because it's all well and good just being honest and saying, you know, Max is a great driver, and any team with a vacancy has to consider him if we think there is a chance of getting him. I understand that. I think that's absolutely fine. But when you go to the lengths of stating, you know, he has been flat out and said that it's the number one choice if he becomes available. I think at one point he said like any team on the grid would do handstands to get him or something like that.
I don't see how that helps you sign him.
Unless he's very impressed by like magic tricks and the circus acts and stuff like that. Perhaps, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it just feels a little bit like, I don't know if like Toto's just over-egging things a little bit. Like I don't know if it's a mix of sincere interest in Max and just wanting to, you know, stick the knife into Red Bull a little bit while that team's battling all sorts of things off track, and making it very, very, very clear to Max, oh, you do have another option, just in case Max is seriously considering leaving. But he needs to be careful, I think, because if Max comes out at any point and just says, this is stupid, I'm never going to go there, they're going to look quite silly, aren't they?
Yeah, let's focus on the Red Bull seat that is available, because Sergio Perez is out of contract for next year. And Scott, while we maybe went into this year thinking, is this a Daniel Ricciardo, Yuki Tsunoda type deal? Christian Horner's kind of blown this one wide open as well, hasn't he? By saying that Red Bull may have to look outside of its own driver pool. That makes things much more interesting.
Yeah, it is fascinating because it means it isn't just incumbent Perez versus, the quite convenient plug-in replacement Daniel Ricciardo or the left field Yuki Tsunoda, who just doesn't seem to matter what he does. I don't think he's being taken seriously by the Red Bull hierarchy at the moment. It brings your Alonso's and your Carlos Sainz and maybe even an Alex Albon type into the mix. Obviously, Albon needs to be get out of his Williams contract that he has for 2025 to do that. But we know that Red Bull was seriously interested in him. And the fact that Red Bull has such a wide range of options and is willing to consider options outside the pool means every other team pretty much has to wait for the dominoes to start falling. It all hinges on what Red Bull does and what that competition is. Is it just going to be a straight Perez versus Ricciardo versus Sainz versus Albon for the second seat? And if one of those gets it, where do they go from there? If Alonso's not going to be able to get into Red Bull in either seat, whether it's in place of Verstappen or alongside Verstappen, is he going to have to try and push his way into Mercedes? But we know that Andrea Kimi Antonelli is, if everything goes well in his rookie F2 campaign, he's a brilliant left field candidate for them to put him into F1 while he's still only a teenager. So then what happens to Alonso? If Alonso gets out of Aston, who takes his seat? Aston Martin's a plum seat going forward. So it's really, really interesting, but you have to wait for that first domino to fall at Red Bull.
Sainz is the logical option, isn't he, for that seat, you would say, at Red Bull? If they're going only with their head, he's the best driver from a top team available. And I know there's this whole argument that there's tension between Verstappen and Sainz going back to when they were rookies at Toro Rosso, but they're different guys now, and I think that was more to do with the big personalities of the fathers and making sure their sons' careers weren't harmed when they were in the formative stage. So I think a Sainz-Verstappen combination would be really attractive for Red Bull, and probably Sainz should be their number one priority in terms of signing someone outside the pool.
I also think Sainz would be a great option for Aston Martin if Alonso goes. He's a driver you can build that team around. Now, there's so many moving pieces in all of this, Ben. If it was a game of musical chairs and I was involved in it, I'd be quite nervous. There's definitely a chance that somebody is going to miss out on a top seat. Is that where Audi comes into the equation? And not, the Sauber team is not actually going to be Audi until 2026. But is there an opportunity for someone to get in there a year early, have the team built around you, and I assume get paid quite well?
Yeah, I think there is, but it's risk if you're a driver in the kind of Alonso Sainz bracket.
Alonso doesn't have time.
No, he doesn't.
I know he said he could race until he's 50. He should go there. And
he disagrees with you.
Bet.
He's going to need longer not longer than that for Sauber to become a competitive prospect in Formula One at this rate.
He might become fully geriatric by the time that team really kicks into gear. So for Alonso, it's the short game. For Sainz, I think it's too risky unless he just wants to cash out. And like you say, Glenn, it's a massive, massive deal. That kind of eye-watering money. I just think they have better options. Teams like Aston Martin are further ahead. So for drivers who are kind of mired in the lower midfield, Scott mentioned Albon earlier, Williams, for all the will in the world and, good management now, it's going to take them an age to get into a serious competitive situation, I think, from an infrastructure point of view. So a sideways move to an Audi team where that investment seems like it's a bit quicker and more forthcoming, that might make sense. Also, if you're in the Alpine team, which is a works outfit, but an absolute basket case at the moment, if you want out of there, then again, switching to a different manufacturer team makes sense. But for the top guys in the top 5 teams, I'd say it's too much of a risk.
Where those drivers are in a good position is that if you're looking at an Audi, which is kind of in this sort of like weird limbo between those really good sort of short-term options, ideally a Red Bull or a Mercedes, but even an Aston Martin. But Audi is more attractive than Williams, for example, because it is still a longer term project than the others, but it isn't something that's going to be dragged out over several years or shouldn't be dragged out over 5 or 6 years, for example.
Money is being pumped in, isn't it?
Exactly, and it's Audi.
It's just the pit stops that take forever.
But it is Audi, and one of the things I remember speaking to some people in the Sainz camp in Bahrain, for example, and they were saying, when Audi does something, and Carlos Sainz Senior knows this very well, having won the Dakar with them, when Audi commits to something, they do commit to it properly, so you can have a little bit more faith there, and that will make that team quite an interesting middle ground option for the likes of Sainz if he needs it, or especially an Albon or an Esteban Ocon. Ben mentioned the Alpine drivers. That's much less of a sort of backwards move for them, and it's sideways at worst, but with a little bit more obvious potential around it. So for those teams, for those drivers, it is a fascinating option. But you end up in a situation where, let's say Alonso stays at Aston Martin and you only have one driver slot in at Red Bull. You could have Carlos Sainz, Alex Albon, Pierre Gasly, Esteban Ocon all fighting over only one, maybe two vacancies at Audi, and someone's going to have to miss out. Or two or three drivers are going to have to miss out.
And there's more pressure coming up from underneath too, more than in the last few years. We've got Ollie Behrman, who's already proven he can get the job done in Formula One, subbing for Carlos Sainz at Ferrari. He's almost certain to be on the grid next year, probably in place of one of the Haas drivers. And Scott mentioned Andrea Kimi Antonelli earlier. Maybe Mercedes is too much too soon for 2025, but even so, he's very likely to make it onto the grid, getting blooded somewhere else, maybe at Williams. So there's at least two seats up for grabs at the bottom end, if you like, which puts even more pressure on those drivers in the middle to find a home for next season.